Did you know that CSS is not a particularly difficult language? Truth be told, even if you have been using CSS for a long time, you will almost certainly come across properties that you have never used, or values you have never considered, or even specification details you have never heard of. Hi guys, today I, Bhavita, will take you through one of the most important and interesting topics of CSS called CSS Transitions. So let's go ahead and look at the agenda for today. We're going to start off the session by understanding the role of CSS in web development. After that, we'll learn what CSS transition is. Next, we'll see what are the browsers that support the transition. Next, we'll understand how exactly to use the CSS transitions. And further, we'll look into the styling properties and then get into the speed accuracy for transitions. Moving ahead, we'll compare transitions and transformation and learn about some of the properties. And finally, we'll close the session with a hands-on demonstration. So before we get started, make sure you're subscribed to Edureka YouTube channel. Also, to stay updated about most trending technologies, hit the notification bell. Now, if you're looking for an online training certification, do check out the link given in the description box below. So CSS plays an important role in developing an impressive and interactive web pages. Cascading style sheets, commonly known as CSS, is basically a language used to describe presentation of web pages, including colors, layouts, and fonts, etc. Right. Now, it allows you to adapt the presentation to different types of devices like your computer screens or your mobile screens or even the printers. Now, here I might also add that it is independent of HTML and can be used with any XML-based markup language. Now, basically in CSS, there are a set of rules which are incorporated to HTML elements via our selector, which will help us have our stylish pages. Now, although I've mentioned that CSS is independent of HTML, together HTML, CSS, and JavaScript make up the essential building blocks of website. Now, with our CSS controlling page appearance, JavaScript programming its functionality, HTML is used to describe structure of the information. It's like you can think that HTML document provides the bones for your web page, while CSS provides skin and JavaScript is like your brains. Now again, there are several advantages of using CSS in web pages, like it's quick in loading and less of a bandwidth, which will make the subsequent pages load faster. Now, there is multiple browser compatibility, making any website based on CSS appear similar in every browser. Ability to position elements anywhere, which means a developer can change position of a particular element if it doesn't go well there. Also, the colors, images, and other things which are difficult to print can be eliminated and printed easily. Adding on, we have some more advantages like customization, search engine friendly, and a lot more. Now, let's move on and understand what exactly CSS transition is. So CSS transition is basically a module of CSS that lets you create gradual transition between the values of specific CSS properties. Right. Now, it's actually going to allow you to change values very smoothly. Now, this can happen with a certain set of properties over a specific set of time, right? Now, here you see a web page that is designed without CSS or any kind of your specification or your styling properties versus the web page which has transition property. Now, this is a brief about CSS transitions. We'll get to know more about it going ahead in today's session. Now guys, speaking about browser compatibility, by now you already know that transition is extremely compatible with all the browsers in almost all kinds of your screens, right? But here we're going to focus on certain versions of each browser. Speaking of Chrome, firstly, we have CSS transition, which is partially compatible with a prefix called WebKit. So using WebKit as your prefix, it'll be very compatible. Next, we have Safari, which is partially supporting with a prefix WebKit again. Now, so this WebKit is a prefix that should be added in order to make it really compatible. Now, speaking of Mozilla Firefox, this property is supported with the prefix Moz. So the prefix used here is not the one which is used for Chrome or Safari. For here in Mozilla, you use Moz. Next, we have Internet Explorer. To be honest, it doesn't support for certain versions like browser 9 or 6. Otherwise, it's really compatible. Next, we have Opera, which has a prefix O to be really compatible. Now, let's move on and understand how to use these transitions. So, to create a transition effect, you must specify two things. The first one is the CSS property you want to add onto the effect. Now, for this, there are certain set of properties which we'll get into. For now, let's take a look at the second thing that we need, which is duration of the effect. Also, here you need to keep in mind that if the duration is not specified, the transition will have no effect. Now, this will happen because the default value is 0, right? Now, let's take a look at an example. So, say you want to display an image of 100 pixel with a transition time of 2 seconds. You can specify the background like a div element is here, and for this div element you can specify these elements like width, height, background, transition, etc. Here transition effect will start only when the specified CSS property changes the values. So now I've spoken so much about styling and techniques, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at styling properties. The first one here is the transition property. This specifies the name or names of the CSS properties to which transition should be applied. So using this property, you can basically specify the name of any particular property you want to implement. Right, next we have transition duration. This is the duration over which transition should occur. You can specify a single duration that applies to all properties during the transition, and this will actually allow you for multiple duration also, but over a different period of time. Now next we have transition timing function, which specifies a function to define how intermediate values for properties are computed. So most timing functions can be specified by providing the graph or corresponding function. Now this is basically a timing function which specifies the transition time. And final property which will help you in styling better is transition delay, which defines how long to wait between the time a property is changed and the transition actually begins. Now next, we'll look into some of the examples. Here's an example indicating all the properties we have just learned. As you can see here, we define the transition property in font size and duration and delay in seconds. Now your font size will be in pixel, which is basically your image that you need for transition. Now if we have to break down and get a property formula for your transitions, you can take a look at here. Transform here is a CSS property, while 250 milliseconds is your duration and timing function is linear. So guys, we just learned about delay and duration part of our transition, right? Now, what if we want to have an accuracy on our speed? Now let's go ahead and see how this could be done. For this, we have transition timing function property, right? Here, this basically specifies speed curve of your transition effect. For this to happen, there are a set of values we should consider. Firstly, we have ease, which specifies transition effect with a slow start, then fast, and then end it. And this ending happens really slow. And then there is linear, which specifies a transition effect with same speed from start to end. Now we have ease in, which specifies transition effect with a very slow start. Next, ease out, again transition effect with a slow end. Now we have ease in and out, which specifies transition effect with slow start and slow end. Now step start and step end, by now you have already an idea with ease in and ease out. It will just step up your start and it will decrease a step in your end. Now next, we see here the curve that we have specified and we've just discussed about. As you can see, your distance, which is your image length in pixels, increases, the speed is faster, while as the image length decreases, the speed is slower. That being your duration speed, Now let's look at our delay for our transition effect. Now this is specified in seconds as to how many seconds of delay would a particular transition for an image would have. Now your delay could even start from 1 second, right? Now it's said that transition has a secret twin to operate with. That's called transformation. So let's go ahead and learn about them together. Guys, by now already you would be telling the definition of transition yourself. One last thing would be it makes the element smoothly and gradually change from one state to another. Right, it's like transition are the grease in the wheel of CSS transformation. Without the transition, an element being transformed would change abruptly from one state to another. Now, what you see here basically could happen even in case you hover on the screen as well. So you see how smoothly the transition is happening, right? Now that we have reviewed how to make smooth and gradual transition, let's look at the CSS transformation. So guys, this is basically how to make an element change from one state to another. With these transformations in CSS, we can actually rotate, move, skew, scale elements. Of course, all these features are only 2D. Now, transformations are triggered when an element changes states, such as on mouse hover or mouse click, etc. Now, here is an example image. You can actually see all the features, that is rotate, move, skew, and scale, that's been implemented here. And that too without a mouse hover, which is shown for you, but the protocol stays the same anyhow. It's just an example that I'll be showing here. With that said, let's move on into the final part of today's session. Of course, before demonstration, let's take a look at some of the properties. Now, I'm pretty sure that you guys might already be guessing the property tag that we need to use for specifying the property. Yes, you got it right. It's the transition property. Now, normally it is used as part of transition shorthand. It's used to define what property or properties you want to apply on transition effect. So as you can see here, you can give the value to your tag. Now your value could be anything like a single property name or a comma separated list of property names, a keyword none, which basically indicates that no property will transition, or keyword all, which indicates all properties will transition. Now, finally, if you remember, these are the properties that we learned about in our speed accuracy part of today's session. Here, we have applied those properties to hover our box and hence use the keyword hover for your ID box. Now, box is the ID here, which has basically property for a particular image that should be having in order to display your transitions. Assuming that was understood and clear, I would like to jump into the demonstration part. But before we go ahead, let's look into a small installation and setup. So now to understand the installation and setup, firstly, we're going to have to install an editor. And here we're using Visual Studio Code. So let's go ahead and install the Visual Studio Code editor. Now I just say Visual Studio Code and you see that there is different options given here. Here I just say download Visual Studio. Now according to the operating system that you're using, you can install your Visual Studio Code. As mine is Windows, I'm going to have to use Windows. I say just download or I just click on this button. Now as you can see, there is an exe version that's been downloaded over here. Once this has happened, I'm going to have to click on this and you're going to get a couple of messages and permissions that you'll have to accept. Now, as you can see, it says setup has detected Visual Studio, which means I have already downloaded Visual Studio Code and hence this is the condition that I'm getting. Now, there's no problem with that. I'm going to go ahead and open. So this is how your Visual Studio Code will look once you finish your installation and the setup. Now, as you can see, there are many options here. There is extensions. You have run and debug here. And then you have source control. You can search for any particular code over here. and to open your files and explore. Now, in order to configure this, I will have to go through different procedures. I'll just show you some of them. So I go to extensions, and in order for us to have our HTML and CSS code work in a smooth way, I'll have to install a couple of packages here. Firstly, I'm going to go ahead and install all the packages related to HTML. So I might have to install this. It's HTML CSS support. I've already installed, so it just says I can either disable or uninstall. And then I have to go ahead and install HTML snippets again. Since I've installed, it says uninstall. And the next necessary package is your IntelliSense, which you'll have to install. Now, there is one more called as HTML hint. If you scroll through, you can find it here. Again, you'll have to install this. Now, these are the packages that you'll have to install in order for our application to work smoothly. And if we need any particular updation for our code, or it will suggest automatically, there is auto suggestions, things like these. So it's very important for us to practice a healthy style of coding. And this is what these packages might help us do. Now I go ahead and install the packages related to CSS. I'm going to install Beautify CSS firstly, which is important. So that's here. I install it here. And then next we have IntelliCode. As I said, just like HTML and CSS, for our Visual Studio Code to work in a smooth way and to have its all the latest features, we have to install such packages. That could be IntelliCode Visual Studio. Now I'm going to go ahead and install this. And for our server, to give our output, we need to install some of the packages such as Live Server. I'm going to install this. And we have Live Server Preview. That's going to be here. And we're going to install this as well. So we'll go ahead and see what these packages will do. For now, let's close this installations. As you can see, there is a blank screen here. Now, since all our installation and configuration is done, let's see how we can create a file and establish code, and eventually we'll learn about CSS transitions and how to implement transitions in our CSS code. Now, as you can see, there is open file, so you can open an existing file. Now, in order for us to understand how Visual Studio Code would work, I am going to have to take a folder. I'm going to select a folder here. I just see select folder. Let's see what's going to happen. Now, as you can see, the folder that I just extracted or opened has popped up here. Now, to understand, let's say I open this particular HTML file, which is already existing. Now, as you can see, these are the things that I'm going to address in today's session. For now, just to understand how it will run and how do we execute these, I'm just going to say open with Live Server. Now, if I say that, it's going to open here. Right. Now, you can actually go ahead and open with preview also. For that, you just have to say view, and I'm going to have to say preview. And before you do that, this is the syntax you use. Say preview. Now, when you say that, it says show live server preview. Now, if I do that, you can see the output being shown here itself. Now, if you make any particular changes, it would be shown here itself. So we'll go ahead and learn more about this. For now, this is the installation and setup for your configuring Visual Studio Code. Now, since we've understood installation, setup, and configuration of our Visual Studio Code, let's go ahead and have a hands-on demonstration. Now, for that, I'm going to, again, start with Visual Studio. I'm going to go here, and like I've mentioned before, I'm just going to have to create a file. And since I'm going to start with HTML, let me go ahead and create a sample HTML file. I'm just going to call it test.html. .html should be your extension. And in order for me to have the code and all the basic code structure for HTML, it might take few minutes, but here the perk of using Visual Studio Code is if I just say doc, it's going to give me everything that a basic HTML tag would have. Now, document is the title here, and I'm going to leave that as it is. Just save the file. And in order for us to add CSS property, I'll have to create a file here again. Let's just call it test.css. Now, I don't know what property to add to which kind of message, so I'm going to go ahead and create a tag here, a paragraph tag. To add message, I'm just going to say maybe have a nice day, just a random message, and I'm going to go ahead into the CSS file and add styling property to it. I'll just say color. I'm going to give maybe blue. I give blue color here. And then let's add one more tag to give multiple styling properties. I say h1, just a heading tag, and say good morning or any random message. Save it. Go ahead here. Add your styling property here again. I'm just going to say brown color maybe. Save here. And for us to have the styling property to this particular messages, we'll have to call a link, right? In order for us to call the CSS page. So I'm going to say test.css, just the file that we've been using here to call our CSS property. Save. And now, as I've mentioned before, in order for us to see the output, just say open with live server. Now, as you can see, all our properties have been implemented. Now let's go back. I've already mentioned we can have a preview instead of going to another window. Just say preview here, and here it is. And you don't have to go to another window, just can make any changes. Say I'm going to go ahead and make changes in my CSS. I'm going to say remove this, save. Now we have black. That's the default because I've not given any kind of styling property here. So this is perks of using preview window. Now we know the basics. Let's get into the CSS transition part right ahead. Now let's go ahead and see the transition properties. For that, I have created a CSS file similarly to our test CSS called transition. There's nothing much here. I've just added a box property. As we have already learned, these are some of the properties of our transitions. We have box and box hover. Let's not get into box hover as I'm not addressing box hover at the moment. Now, seeing a box, I've just added a parameter called background, where the background of the box is red and the width is particularly 300 pixel and height is also 300 pixel. Now for us to have these properties being implemented, all we have to do is, yes, you got it right, you have to call the transition.css file. Right, now I save it, nothing is happening, right? So the thing that I've missed here is adding the class box. Now you should be doing this because it is not going to understand what property should be implemented, as the box is a parameter that is present in our CSS, but HTML doesn't know what is box here. So I'm going to go ahead and give a div tag here. I say class because I'm going to have to call my box. And here, after mentioning box, I just say save. There you go. Now this is applied the properties that you have given inside the box class. Now let's go ahead and add some of the other properties like transition duration, right? Now I say for 1 second, I'm just going to say 1000 milliseconds. It suggested that we mention all our durations in milliseconds. I save it. Now this is happening because I have not enabled the hover. So if I just save, every time I save, this is displaying, and it's taking 1 second for our box to display. Now, say if I change my duration time, I say 500 milliseconds, and every time I save, it's happening a little bit faster. Now, as we mentioned, this is happening quick, right? Now, let's go ahead and see what happens if I give it in seconds. Say now I give in 1 second and save, it's happening. Now, do you wonder that it's not hovering on your cursor? Now, this is because, like I mentioned, hover is not enabled because I have given both the colors in hover and in the box as the same. Now, what if I say this as black? Now, let's go ahead. Look at that. Now, because we're having a little problem in viewing it, let's give this as black while this as red. I save it. By default, it's black. Hover it. Turns out to be red. Now, this is happening quite slow because I've given it as 1 second. I'm going to go ahead and change this as maybe 0.5 seconds, as we're doing it in terms of seconds. But again, I recommend you to do it in milliseconds, so I'm going to just stick on to 500 milliseconds. There you go. The hover is perfect. Now let's go ahead and learn about one more interesting topic, that is transition property, that we've already learned in theory. Now, if you notice, it's taken for Opera. If you remember, I mentioned for Opera to be really compatible, I give prefix as O. So that's what it's taking, but let's not keep that in mind right now. Let's go ahead and do it for everything in common. The transition property, let's apply the property to our background. Now we have background here for hover. I'm going to go ahead and say background. Going to spell it out right. Or just copy this, paste it here. And you see, it's happening to the background. Or let's say with respect to the background. Now, what if I change this property to width maybe? There is a property called width, right? So the transition duration is happening with respect to our width. Sorry, let's say width. Do you see that? It's happening to the width. Now I say height. So these are some properties that you'll see not making difference right now, but going ahead, if you improve your page or your website to a greater extent, these small properties make a huge difference. Now let's go ahead and give one more property to our hover box, which we'll see, and probably these things might make a difference then, which you might understand in a more clearer format. I'm going to say transform. This is a property, and I say rotate. So I'm going to have to rotate this box, this particular box. Say I'm going to rotate it for 90 degrees. I say save. Of course, nothing is happening because I didn't give my property as transform. Now I say transform. I say this. Look at that. Cool, right? On hovering, it's rotating 90 degrees. Now you can change it to 180 maybe. I save. There you go. One full rotation is there, or even 45 degree. That's that. Now this is happening because I have mentioned my property as transform here. Let's say I want to mention both background and transform, because you see, I want to take all my properties there because it's happening in a very weird format. Now, what if I say all? So we've already mentioned and spoken about this. If I say all, it's going to take all my properties there, right? So when I mention all, it means it's going to take property of height, width, background, transformation, everything together. Now, generally what happens is all your animations and your rotations and your transitions is happening by our CPU. So sometimes there is a technical glitch inside CPU where even if you have not mentioned that particular transition, that will automatically happen. So it is better and cleansing to avoid all and to mention the properties that you actually want. So I want here just background. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this, say paste, comma, I say transform. Now I do this, I say save. It's going to take only these two properties. This is a cleaner way of using your properties for transition. Of course, you can go ahead and use all or mention particular property or even sometimes not mention. But again, it's for a cleaner view. Now, since we've learned about this transition property, let's go ahead and learn about one more property. That's transition timing function. We've already come across this theoretically. Now, again, I have discussed about 𝐂𝐝𝐵. This is going to help you add certain coordinates where our rotation and transition will have a better way of displaying it. Now, before we get into that, let's see ease in and ease out. If you remember, I have mentioned about that. So that's ease. So here in timing function, what exactly happens here is when I say ease, it's going to take these properties while it's going to ease in. Like your transformation happens in a more easy way. To understand that better, let's use all other properties so that we'll see the changes, differences, and hence. Do you see that? There is a firm kind of rotation happening there. But if you say ease, there is kind of, ease there. It's again very small difference which you can make out only with a large kind of operations. But here we are to experiment with different kinds of properties and how it works and how you can use it, things like that. So now you have known about ease in, ease out. Now I'm sure you have a little bit of confusion as to how this is actually working. Let's go ahead and see how this works in your front end page. For that, the best thing that you could ever do is you have to inspect. For that to happen, I'm going to go ahead and open this in live server. Now, if you see here, there is this happening, and I'm going to go ahead and inspect this. While I inspect, I need to click on this. If you see here, come down here to our styles and see our timing function. It says ease out. Now to understand that, let's see this. See, there's an interesting factor here, how ease in and our ease out works. There is, different ways of animations and transitions happening here, which we do not actually notice when we do it from our front end. But if you see here, there is so much happening there. The curves, I have actually explained it theoretically as to how this graph works. Now, if you see it, there is different ways. Now, let's go ahead and see how it works for ease in. These are the curves for ease out. Now, looking at ease in, say I give ease in here, there, save it, go back to this, reload, ease in, look. Now, each curve is definitely different. So this is about our transition timing function. Now say, what if I want to give all these functions together? It'd be cool, right? So all I have to do for that is I just have to mention property or just say transition, and I give my background, and then I give my duration, and I could comment this out. I say, now this is a syntax used for comment, which most of us might already know. Save. So even though I haven't mentioned any of this, all the duration and all your rotation is happening. And that's because you can do it in one particular property itself. Now, before I wind up, there's one more thing that probably I might have missed out. That is your delay. Now, that's something that we have learned already. Let's see how our delay works. I say transition delay, and I say 2000 milliseconds. Like, let's have our transition occur after, now I'll just remove that. Now if you see, after 2 seconds, your box is appearing. After 2 whole seconds, your hover is occurring. See that? And nobody wants such a huge delay, right? So maybe 1 second or 500 millisecond. Even that seems a bit slow, but it's again fine. Now, if I don't have this and save it, it's quick enough. Right, now that we've almost addressed all our properties, we can put all our properties in the transition. Like I have already told you, I'm going to mention background and my duration and my 𝐂𝐼𝐧. Let's add my delay as well, just to see all our properties appear there. I have my transform also. I'm going to spell it out right. Now I comment the rest of it with your all our properties are still being uploaded. So now instead of applying all these properties singularly, you can use one particular property command and implement all your given transition properties. That was all about today's session for CSS transition. I hope you have learned something about the properties and CSS transition properties. Until we meet again next time, happy learning.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!